Okay, it's time for another progressive metal album of the year. I thought that we were kind of finished with all the releases from some progressive metal stuff, but man, one always likes to creep up near the end, so let's dive into it. Dividing Lines by Threshold. So, Threshold is a UK progressive metal band getting their starts pretty early on, if I'm being honest, within the progressive metal scene. Getting their start at the kind of mid to late 80s, starting off by playing covers of metal groups like Rat and Testament, and continuing to write their own songs, and finally putting out their first record, I believe back in, what was it, like 93 or so, like 93 or 94, when they finally signed themselves to a label. And yeah, I mean, from there, they've kind of gone through the gamut of individuals and players, mixing and matching their different musicians, but staying pretty faithful to their core sound. Currently within the roster, we have Carl Groom on lead guitars, backing vocals, and a little bit of keyboards every once in a while, at least from the beginning. I think he's done away with them now. Richard West on keyboards and backing vocals. I believe it's Joanne, but it could be Joanne James on drums. We have Glenn Morgan on lead vocals now, taking over from Damian Wilson, who I believe actually took over from Damien and Glenn. Like, the two were kind of going back and forth for a little bit. And then Steve Anderson on bass and backing vocals. I really got into them with their last album of Legend of the Shires, and it was fine. My main criticism of that one was that it was just a little too long, like the actual runtime itself did it a disservice, because a lot of the music found, was very samey by the end of it. And because it was so long, it was really hard for me to kind of disentangle and distinguish like one track from another, because they really did bleed into one another without too much variation. Coming into Divided Lines, kind of the same main criticism of this album. It is over an hour. It's an hour and 4 minutes across 10 tracks. And I do feel as though they probably could have eliminated about 2 or 3 of these tracks, cut it down to maybe about 50 minutes, maybe even like 45 minutes, and not really lost too much in the fold. Now, I will say, like, this album has a little bit more of a sticking power than the Songs from the Shire was. For the most part, it's a little bit more heavy and a little bit darker than that album, which I immediately enjoy. Like, the first track of Haunted hits you really hard right off the get-go, that I really enjoy. It's very driven, there's a lot of energy to it, and there's a lot of power behind it. This is what I really want from this style of progressive metal. Because this isn't like the extreme tech metal or a death metal or a black metal, it really is just straight up standard progressive metal. You want to have that kind of energy to kind of keep the listener engaged, or at least for my ears, that does like something either a little bit more sharp, a little bit more punchy, or a little bit more experimental within my metal music. If it's just, I don't want to say plain Jane everyday old metal, I'm always looking for something a little bit different, just to keep me engaged, to keep me excited. Now, luckily, there are a few moments on this album that do have that. The third track of Let It Burn has some really interesting lyrical content that I really like, talking about how the earth doesn't belong to us, we don't really even belong to the earth, we need to really take stock of what we are doing, because if we don't really own it, should we be doing what we're doing? And I really like that effect on it. My favorite track by far is, it should come as no surprise if you know me, the fifth track, the longest track of Domino Effect, because I like how this track goes on in different waves. It does remind me of Domino from Genesis, in that we've got different sections and different aspects on this that help divide the actual listening experience to little bite-sized chunks. And I enjoy kind of how this track kind of levies off a little bit. We get some narrative, almost spoken word aspect, and then it picks up with a vengeance with a really tasty and really mighty keyboard lick that, this is part of the reason why I come to this style of progressive metal music, because The musicianship is what's bringing us to the table and making us really excited for it. So, man, I love that track. I just wish that they had a little bit more of a flavor and a little bit more of a flair to it without just being run-of-the-mill progressive metal stuff. And again, I don't want to just shit all over that in that sense. But, when we get to the latter half of this album with King of Nothing and Lost Along the Way, you could basically intermix these tracks without really losing anything because, there's not too much of a distinct personality on these guys. And I do know, like, if you're a fan of this style of progressive metal music, it's not going to bother you the same way that it bothers me. There's a lot of safe playing styles on this as well. Like, there's nothing too offensive about this. There's not a whole lot of risks or experiments that are being going on this album. And if you're a fan of that, like if you want to sit down and pretty much know what you're getting from the first 2 tracks for the rest of the album, you're going to be very pleased about this album. Because once you kind of get Haunted and Hall of Echoes and Let It Burn, the first 3 tracks off of this album, you pretty much know the rest of the album going forward. But there are still some flavors and some mixes in the bunch that kind of perked my ears a little bit. I did kind of comment a little bit with Lost Along the Way, but at least I like how there's a little bit more of like a neo-prog feel on this one. They're definitely channeling some Arena, which is where, the Passinger has kind of migrated to, in that kind of flair and that style. I'm getting a lot of that neo-prog playing of guitars and keyboards, loving the production side of that, loving the sounds that the keyboardist is playing with. Really fun along that sense, and the energy, at least by the end, is still able to keep up the pace with tracks like Run and Defense Condition, and Defense Condition being the second longest track at just under 11 minutes. It's 10 minutes and 44 seconds, but it does feel like they're starting to run out a little bit of steam with Defense Condition. And I mean, it's still a fine track, and they do end a little bit on a high note in that sense, but I was kind of hoping for a really nice big explosion at the end, and it was just kind of like, small little firework display. The last track that I want to talk about is Complex and Silenced, the 4th and 6th track. I like how both of these are kind of giving like a little bit of a different facet to this band. They're not really deviating too far away from the norm, but at least with Silence, we have a little bit more of that neo-prog that I really enjoy in this bigger, harder, metally landscape, because neo-prog back in the late 2000s was really flirting and really playing a lot with the metal scene. So it's really interesting to see a metal band flirt and play with the neo-prog scene. But I like some of the vocal effects that we have with On Silence. I like some of that flair. And Complex, the 6th track, is really rocking. Again, it's that energy that these boys are able to command. It's that energy that really pushes the band forward in this sense that I really, really enjoyed. I just wish that they kind of did this a little bit more with the rest of the album. So in the end, Divided Lines is a really, really good time if you're a fan of this style of progressive metal. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you are a fan of just straightforward prog metal, you're going to have a good time with this. But if you're looking for something that changes the mold a little bit, experiments a little bit, you're not going to find it on here, and you'll probably leave a little bit disappointed. But yeah, like I said, if you just want some good old-fashioned prog metal, you're going to have a good time. So yeah, it's for that reason that I would say that Dividing Lines from Threshold is one that I would at least download. There's enough on here to keep me excited. There's enough on here to, groove along when it's on, but not enough really to go and seek it out. It's one that if you don't immediately go and listen to it, I'm not going to fault you for it. If you're going to take your time and get into it eventually, sure. Yeah, it's not going to change anybody's minds about progressive metal in one way or another. That's my take-home message of this album. But I want to know what you guys thought about this album. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, please let me know by commenting down below. And yeah, that's all I've got for you guys today. So thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.